Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akere-Doluale. The headlines. Britain's Prime Minister Liz Truss vows to match UK spending on military support to Ukraine next year as attention shifts back to politics. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky issues a warning to Russian soldiers occupying territory in Ukraine. Flee or surrender. And Moscow urges tightening of the Biological Weapons Convention to make it more legally binding as it accuses the United States and Ukraine of violating the agreement. We begin the program this morning with British Prime Minister Liz Truss' promise that the United Kingdom will match or exceed the amount of military aid spent on Ukraine next year. Ms. Truss says she will pledge military aid worth billions during a trip to meet world leaders in New York this week. According to her, she will use her speech at the United Nations General Assembly in New York tomorrow to rally support for Ukraine as well. The trip comes at a time of global economic turmoil driven by soaring energy prices and the Ukraine war. The United Kingdom has been one of the leading donors of military aid to Ukraine, committing £2.3 billion since Russian President Vladimir Putin's forces invaded the country in February. Meanwhile, Republican senators have also signaled tentative support for additional Ukraine aid that the Joe Biden administration has requested following a classified briefing yesterday night. The Biden administration had asked for $12 billion in aid to Ukraine to be added to the continuing resolution that's needed to keep the government open past September the 30th. Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn has said that negotiators are still discussing the makeup of a package for Ukraine, but that it would be about $11 billion, which could include humanitarian, economic, and military assistance. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that he expects Congress to approve a Ukraine military aid in the continuing resolution, but is worried GOP support for Ukraine could corrode in the future. And Taiwan is, quote, proud of its efforts in helping Ukraine with its struggle to defend itself. And those efforts must continue, and that's according to President Tsai Ing-wen in her remarks played at the Concordia Summit in New York yesterday. The self-ruled island has donated more than $30 million for humanitarian relief, mostly raised from the public, and joined in Western-led sanctions against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine in February. Ukraine's plight has won broad sympathy in Taiwan, with many seeing parallels between its situation and the threat Taipei's government says it faces from China, which views the island as its own.
As we watched the carnage of Russian invasion, Taiwan is proud to play a role in the effort to assist the Ukrainians in their struggle to defend their country and freedom. We must continue with our efforts. We have to educate ourselves on the authoritarian playbook and understand that Taiwan's democracy will not be the only thing the PRC seeks to extinguish. Securing Taiwan's democracy is imperative in securing freedom and human rights for our collective future.
In Ukraine itself, President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russia is palpably panicking as his country continues to mount a counter-offensive that has reclaimed towns and cities from Russian troops. In his nightly video address, President Zelensky said Ukraine was, quote, stabilizing the situation in the northeastern Kharkiv region, which is now largely back in Ukrainian hands. The president earlier vowed there would be no let-up in Ukraine's fight to regain its territory, as Kiev said its troops had crossed a major river, paving the way for an assault on Russia's occupation forces in the eastern Donbas region. In recent days, the pace of the advance has again slowed, but President Zelensky said this was only because the forces were consolidating and preparing for further offensives.
I held a new meeting of the headquarters of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. We meet every time when we have significant news from the front line. the Kharkiv region. We're stabilizing the situation, holding our positions firmly, so strong that the occupiers are really panicking. Well, we've warned the Russian soldiers in Ukraine have only two options: to flee from our land or surrender. The collaborators have similar options. Either they will try to escape, and it is yet unclear whether Russia will let them into its territory, despite giving them its passports, or the collaborators will be convicted according to applicable Ukrainian law. What's very important at the meeting of the headquarters, we have discussed the situation on the state border, the protection of our border. The head of the state border service delivered a report. The state will provide all the necessary power to protect our border. The pace is very important now. The pace of stabilization in the liberated areas, the pace of movement of our troops, the pace of restoration of normal life in the liberated territory, and the pace of support from partners. We speak about this honestly. The pace of providing aid to Ukraine should correspond to the pace of our movements.
And 13 people were killed in artillery shelling in the East Ukrainian separatist-held city of Donetsk. Donetsk separatist Mayor Alexei Kulemzin had posted on Telegram that 13 civilians, including 2 children, had been killed in the strike on Donetsk's Kubishevsky district. He said that the number of wounded was being confirmed. Donetsk city has been controlled by Russian-backed Donetsk People's Republic forces since 2014. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forensic experts have so far exhumed 146 bodies, mostly civilians, at a mass burial site near the town of Izium in eastern Ukraine, and some bear signs of a violent death. That's according to the reports. President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that some 450 bodies are believed to have been buried at the site in a forest on the outskirts of Izium, which was recently recaptured by Ukrainian forces during a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. Ole Sinehubov, governor of Kharkiv region, said the exhumed bodies also included the children mentioned earlier. He added that some of the dead have signs of a violent death. There were bodies with tied hands and traces of torture. The deceased were also found to have explosive, shrapnel, and stab wounds. The forensic experts, dressed in white protective suits and wearing rubber gloves, have been working methodically for days to exhume and identify the bodies whose makeshift graves were marked by wooden crosses. Serhiy Bolvinov, chief of investigative department of the Kharkiv police, said some of the bodies decomposed, which made it hard to establish the damage done to them. Earlier, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov had rejected Ukraine's allegations as a, quote, lie. Let's speak now to Dennis River, a researcher, Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. He joins us virtually. Good morning to you, Dennis.
Good morning.
Let's start from the various issues that have been in the news most recently. Let's start with the mass graves that have been discovered, and which identification of bodies and so on is said to be going on. If this proves indeed to have been what happened, it's going to be difficult to get hold of the perpetrators, and it's also going to be equally difficult to identify who are those who were the victims. So what would be the purpose of all of this?
Well, the purpose first and foremost is to shine the light on what Russia has been doing in Ukraine and in the occupied territories, and has been doing for the past, well, more than 200 days. And I think one thing that is very important to note here is that although we're discussing Izum, and previously we discussed Bucha, a similar case where a lot of dead bodies were recovered. It's important to know that there were other liberated areas, for instance, in the north of Kharkiv, that were liberated before the counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces, and there we saw very similar instances of people being executed, or showing the signs of being executed and tortured, except the scale was different. So these instances have not received sufficient attention from the media, from political sector. So what we can say, what the importance of it is really to shine the light, and also perhaps to put the pressure on Russia to at least force Russian forces that are still occupying some of the Ukrainian territories right now to perhaps reconsider and perhaps reconsider the way they treat civilian population in these areas, if not because of the legal norms and standards, at least because of the international pressure. But also, I would like to point out the fact that there we there are ways to determine the perpetrators of the attack. Maybe not the victims necessarily. This is a difficult process indeed, especially if the whole family has been affected. But the perpetrators can be identified. What we've seen in Bucha over the past couple of months, not just successful efforts in identifying people responsible for the deaths and torture in Bucha, but also some of the Russian soldiers that came forward and spoke to Western media and Russian opposition media to discuss their role in committing these crimes. So I think of course, it's one way or another. It is important to shine the light on these crimes and to hopefully put pressure on Russia to cease committing these crimes.
Well, it's important to also point out that Russia has, in fact, denied that it carried out this. There's a bit of tit-tat, if you like, accusations and counter-accusations. But let's come to what is actually happening now. And I want to ask you what I've asked those I've spoken to yesterday and late last week, once this counter-offensive got underway. What is there to prevent the Ukrainians from, shall we say, apart from the fact that the areas being liberated are Ukrainian, but what is there to stop them from also carrying out what in some people's eyes would be regarded as war crimes or crimes against humanity as a form of revenge on Russian forces if they eventually capture some or get get their hands on some of the civilians who are Russians, those who have collaborated with the Russians who are in fact Ukrainians, and the like. I mean, it would be a question of two wrongs, wouldn't it?
Well, certainly. However, there is a bit of a distinction, and that being Ukraine is held under a very high standard. Ukraine is in the spotlight. So a lot of countries right now are following the news from Ukraine very closely, and any wrongdoing from the Ukrainian side will undoubtedly be discussed in these societies, in Western societies. And of course, as you know, Ukraine relies on the support from these societies, from the people in these countries, for them to put pressure on the governments, for the governments to support Ukraine. So in that regard, I think we've seen a level of scrutiny when it comes to Ukraine. We've seen instances, several instances, unfortunate instances, where Ukrainian forces were allegedly involved in such actions or conducted such actions, and we've seen a level of scrutiny when international community demanded an investigation, demanded responsibility. In that regard, Russia and Ukraine are held in held to different standards. Russian forces have the privilege of Russia is a superpower, hence applying pressure on Russia is a much more difficult affair, whereas Ukraine depends on international support and hence has to uphold international rules. It will be much more difficult for Ukraine to garner the support if the soldiers are committing crimes against humanity, if the soldiers are committing violent acts and prosecuting these civilians. In fact, I think it's very important to note that up until now, even the incidents that were recorded were very few and far in between. And all in all, we can say that, if anything, Ukrainian legal system has been a bit too lenient on some of these people. There are a number of instances where people were prosecuted for being affiliated with Russia or working for Russia and then released on parole and then obviously allowing them to escape. So I think this international pressure on Ukraine will keep Ukraine accountable from committing these crimes moving forward.
The big news, of course, is that this week, starting this week, the United Nations General Assembly is coming together in New York, and after the burial ceremonies of Queen Elizabeth II yesterday, that's the next focal central point where world leaders meeting. And there you have a mix. Those who are supporting Ukraine, as you pointed out, those who have indicated some level of support for the Russians, and then those who have been in between, like where you are, South Africa. South Africa has sought a diplomatic solution, trying to be even-handed between both parties. Now, do you see anything on the horizon that could make some kind of breakthrough possible diplomatically, the same way that that kind of breakthrough happened with the issue of grain? We talked about it the last time I spoke to you, and you said, well, you didn't really see much. But has that changed now, especially because Ukraine now has some level of leverage which it didn't have before and which it could use when it comes to negotiating?
Well, one of the important developments since the last time we spoke was obviously the very successful counteroffensive of Ukrainian forces. And what it had, the impact it had in the long term, was essentially denying Russia's ability to seek a military victory in Ukraine. If in the beginning of the year, in February and March, we've discussed, how many days, months, or weeks Ukraine can withstand Russian offensive. In April, we started discussing the second stage of Russian offensive in the east. We now see that even these new objectives that were put forward by Putin in April will not be achieved. Russia cannot achieve its military objectives in Ukraine. Russia cannot defeat Ukrainian military. What it means is that Russia will now seek a diplomatic solution and will be more active diplomatically, engaging with African partners, with Latin America, with Asian partners, to force Ukraine to sit on the negotiation table. However, one thing that hasn't changed, and it has remained the same, and actually, if anything, it's gotten more pronounced, and that is Ukraine was not ready to compromise on the territory and any territorial gains that Russia has made since February 24 this year. And Ukraine is even less willing to negotiate territorial gains today. There was an interesting article published by Reuters earlier this month, citing that one of the Russian officials has actually reached an agreement with Ukraine in the beginning of the war, where allegedly Ukraine was ready to compromise the status of some of its territories and was ready to compromise the status of its NATO membership. But at this moment in time, I think Ukraine's position, as you mentioned, has strengthened quite a lot, and any negotiations would require some sort of a compromise being reached. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem at this moment in time that Russia is ready to compromise to the extent that Ukraine would be willing to accept. And of course, any sort of a shortfall when it comes to some of the occupied territories would be unacceptable for Ukraine. And even if Zelensky attempts to push it forward, we know from the social social public opinion polls that were made that people in Ukraine will not accept any negotiations that would include the sovereignty or compromises made to the sovereignty of Ukrainian territories. So, but I think it's an important event nevertheless, and we are moving towards a diplomatic solution because the military option is now out of the table, at least for Russia.
Yes, and one would hope that with the military option now, at a stalemate, if you like, renewed focus would come to the diplomatic side. Dennis River, researcher, Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Still to come on the program, businesses in Turkey feel the pinch of surging energy prices. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. At least 3 buildings were reportedly destroyed during shelling in Ukrainian separatist-held cities of Kadiva in the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic. According to officials of the Republic, Ukrainians bombarded the city with HIMARS rockets, and a children's training school was reportedly damaged. Local officials reported an office complex was also hit with a veterinary hospital and a shop inside of it. Russian and Russian-backed forces seized control of Luhansk province in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine earlier on in the campaign, but Kiev's recent offensive has pushed the fighting closer to the republic. 4 of the 5 European Union countries bordering Russia have begun turning away Russian tourists as at midnight, saying they should not travel while their country is at war with Ukraine. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania imposed new restrictions, while Finland decided to remain open, though it has cut back the number of consular appointments available to Russian travelers seeking visas. The move was the latest in a series of sanctions and other steps taken by the European Union or its member states since Moscow invaded Ukraine on February the 24th in what it called a special military operation. The EU has banned all flights from Russia, leaving only rail and road transport links available. And this month, it agreed to limit issuing free travel Schengen zone visas. The latest entry ban is targeted at tourists and excludes Russian dissidents seeking refuge in the EU, along with lorry drivers, refugees, and permanent residents of EU countries, as well as those visiting family members. The issue of travel to the EU has split the bloc, with capitals such as Berlin and Paris arguing that it would be counterproductive to ban ordinary Russians, a move advocated by Kiev.
We have been trying to convince Finland to come with us together because they will be the sole entry point and they will be under a lot of pressure there. I don't understand why they don't do it because in the words, I mean, the leaders of Finland have been very vocal about this. Of course, there's a loophole and the loophole is Finland. That is true, yes. But it's not entirely effective if Finland is not on board. That is true, but it's still better than nothing. And for our security, I think when we can stop the people's flow at our borders, then it is already a better situation than we can't do that. 2/3 of Russian tourists come via Finland and Estonia to Europe. So clearly putting this on our side is making the pressure to go to Finland, and I really hope that they will join.
Let's talk now to Professor David Awurawo, Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos. Good morning, Prof. Nice to see you once again.
Good morning, Ladi. Nice to be here.
Yes, thanks for being with us. Let's start off with what we just heard now, that there's more pressure on Russia, but this time it's not on the Russian government, it's on the Russian citizenry. 4 of the 5 countries that are in the EU bordering Russia have decided to turn away Russian tourists. But then there's an interesting exception. Lorry drivers, because that would bring they too under pressure, because that would mean that they wouldn't be able to receive essential supplies of food and agricultural products. So again, is this realpolitik at work?
Exactly so. If Russians are not allowed to move into Europe, the 4 close neighbors of Russia, in Europe, and that's Russian tourists. And by the same token, they are saying that lorry drivers are exempted so that food can move from Russia, Ukraine, into Europe. It's realpolitik. National interest being put at the forefront. The one that will affect them negatively, they have tried to exempt, and then everybody else is told not to come. That Russia cannot be at war, and Russian citizens are, going on holiday across Europe. Well, it's part of efforts to pressurize Russia so that the diplomatic engagement with Ukraine and the rest of the international community that is involved in trying to negotiate and then end this war can be successful. It's just part of pressurizing Russia, trying to squeeze Russia as much as possible so that Russia will be amenable to diplomatic engagement to end the war.
Let's look at that diplomatic engagement that you mentioned. I was asking my last guest about that because the United Nations General Assembly, which would be the biggest gathering of those we expect to be diplomats and who are supposed to be taking a deeper look at all of this, those on Ukraine's side, those on Russia's side, those who are in NATO, in the EU, every bloc is supposed to be at the General Assembly. Do you see a situation where, you know, what has proved impossible in the last almost 7 months now could prove possible over the next 1 week or so at the United Nations when all these people are now face to face and they are not discussing across trenches, when they are now sitting down in the same room and eyeballing each other? Do you see a situation where some of the peacemakers, if you like, could somehow wangle out some kind of deal?
Unfortunately, I don't see anything drastic happening in the course of the week at the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. I say this because the success in getting this war concluded or ended will be determined by what Russia and Ukraine do. And from the look of things, both sides are still pursuing their, military engagement, as much as they can. Ukraine now thinks that victory is possible, and so it's trying to, increase the tempo of attacks. Russia is saying no, it will allow itself to be humiliated, and so it's also fighting back. It's even threatening to use nuclear weapons if possible, threatening the international community. So I don't think that diplomatic engagement at United Nations General Assembly this week will be enough to bring the two sides into the negotiating table and end the war. I don't think so.
All right, Professor Orawa, I don't, if you can still hear me, if you're still able to hear me at some point, I was going to ask about the fact that going forward, we want to take a look at the other side of this, which is that if they do not negotiate and they do not reach a solution, a diplomatic solution, and the war has to go on. You've referenced it just now when you said the Russians are now talking about nuclear weapons. Other people will be drawn into the conflict. We have seen this before in other parts of the world. The longer it goes on for, the higher the chances that outside forces will be physically drawn in as each side gets more and more anxious. If that happens, I hate to use the phrase, but could we all be drawn in?
I don't think so. We will not all be drawn in. When everybody comes in like that, it's usually when middle-range powers, less developed countries are involved. You find countries jumping in here and there, each one according to his own interest. Russia is a great power, and Russia is a nuclear power. When you are dealing with a great power and nuclear power, countries are always very, very careful. In fact, one reason why many countries of Europe have been cautious about the kind of weapons they supply to Ukraine and their involvement in the war is because of the status of Russia. So what I foresee is that the fight between Russia and Ukraine will go on for quite some time. There will be a time that both sides will become tired of fighting. Since Russia is able to win an outright war now, it will come a time that it will lose ground and be more disposed to diplomatic engagement.
All right then, Professor Aurao, if you can still hear me, my final question to you would have been that if at this stage that we are now, we are still talking about military engagements, nobody's talking diplomacy, in spite of the optimism that was put forward by the agricultural exports deal that was struck between Ukraine and Russia earlier on, and which somehow, in spite of all the fighting now going on, is still going on. more than 3.9 million tons of grain have been moved while all this battle is going on. So it seems as if, as you referenced earlier, the war is being carefully calibrated not to harm some overall interests. But when those interests get harmed, what do you think will happen?
Well, when all those interests get harmed, it facilitates, it serves as a catalyst for quick resolution. Because when those interests get harmed, those affected negatively will be more extensive across the world. It has a way of serving as a catalyst for a quick resolution. This is something about conflict. When the cause of a conflict is fundamental, something like a zero-sum game, the gain of one is the loss of the other, and it's fundamental, not accidental. That is that it is a matter that affects the very survival of a state. All resources are always deployed to fight it. That is why this war has taken the shape it has taken. Ukraine sees the war as a threat to its very sovereignty and existence, and is determined to fight it to logical conclusion. Russia also sees it in some sense, although I don't agree with that point of view, that Ukraine's bid to join NATO is a threat to its own survival as well. That is why the war has been massive. But if we are to the lessons of history, what lessons of history teach is that given the issues in the war, there will likely be some violent conflict, more extensive, moving forward for the next couple of weeks, probably the next couple of months. And when one side sees that it's losing ground and both sides are getting tired, they become more amenable to diplomatic engagement, and that will help to bring the war to an end, of course, with the support and involvement of other actors in the international system.
Indeed, but we all cannot wait, Professor Orao, for that time to quickly come so that this conflict can be over under some kind of arrangement that both sides see as a win-win. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Professor David Orao is Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos. Thank you so very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. We are very eager to see the war come to an end soon.
Same here. Thank you so much. Let's look at a couple of other issues. Ukraine's agricultural exports on a key grain deal have reached 3.9 million tons, as we've just been reporting. The Ukrainian Seaports Authority, which made the claim, says so far a total of 169 ships have left Ukraine's Black Sea ports for countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa under the deal signed in July. On Monday alone, 4 ships loaded with more than 178,000 tons of foodstuff departed from the ports of Odessa and Privdeni. Ukraine State News Agency reported on Monday that Taras Vyotsovsky, the first Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine, said that the country is expected to harvest about 67 million tons of grain this year, of which at least 45 million tons can be exported. Exports of the new crops will start in October this year. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is expected to sign contracts for liquefied natural gas during his visit to the United Arab Emirates. Economy Minister Robert Habeck, who gave the information, was speaking after a tour of a future NLNG terminal in Lubmin in northern Germany. According to him, the aim is to get gas elsewhere and to then import it into the country. This import is what is Germany's big problem. Which can buy gas. We can buy gas, but we don't have the infrastructure to import it apart from a Lubmin with Nord Stream 1. There's currently no gas flowing through Nord Stream 1 as the shutdown there has exacerbated Europe's worst ever gas supply crisis, with energy prices soaring and German importers even discussing possible rationing. Nord Stream 1 is by far the biggest Russian gas pipeline to Europe, carrying up to 59.2 billion cubic meters of gas per year. Nord Stream 2, which runs almost in parallel to Nord Stream 1, was built a year ago, but Germany decided not to proceed with it just days before Russia sent its troops into Ukraine. And following a warning from Washington that financial institutions risk secondary sanctions if they help Moscow bypass U.S. penalties, Turkey's İşbank and Denizbank announced that they have halted the use of Russia's MIR payment system. The banks confirmed their decision to Russia's RIA Novosti news agency. S-Bank also explained that its decision followed the U.S. Treasury's statement on the subject. Last week, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control had announced that it was ready to impose sanctions on any institution outside Russia using the country's payment system. Later, sources told the Financial Times of the United States and the EU's intention of putting pressure on Turkish banks to prevent them from helping Moscow bypass sanctions. Turkish banks joined the MIR payment network in early August, allowing Russian tourists to pay for their purchases in the country. And businesses in Turkey are feeling the pinch of high costs as global energy prices continue to surge amidst the Russia-Ukraine conflict, prompting the government to increase electricity and natural gas prices. Since early September, natural gas prices have risen by 20.4% for households, by 47.6% for small and medium-sized industrial customers, and by 50.8% for large industrial entities. This is the third increase in gas and electricity prices this year, putting a huge squeeze on companies' profits. Gökhan Tohan, head of the Istanbul Chamber of Industry, who is also a gas equipment manufacturer, says further price hikes could put some smaller industrial companies at risk of suspension or complete shutdown. Tohan also slammed the United States for fanning the flames of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Still to come on the program, as the world bade farewell to Queen Elizabeth II, Atlantic City honors the late British monarch and 3 other world leaders. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. John McWad joins me. I'm not rubbing my hands together for the business update from this conflict. The price of bread has risen by almost a fifth in the European Union just in the month of August.
Yes.
But we're at the same time talking about more exports of grain and wheat and all of that. I guess the question one wants to ask is, what's happening?
Yeah, so of course we have the issue of grain, but we also know that you have a lot of farmers in Europe, all those European countries. We talked about their protests yesterday because of the cheap grain that's coming from Ukraine. But what's really driving this is the issue of fertilizer. Now, ammonia is a major ingredient for making fertilizer, and they get it mostly through the Black Sea from Russia and all of that. And obviously, the disruption at the Black Sea and all of that has stalled the supply of ammonia and fertilizer. So while they do have the farms and they want to produce the grains and all of that, the supply of fertilizer has been disrupted, and that has affected their
capacity to produce
and then combine that with the surging energy prices, which we have obviously been talking about, and then you have this 18% increase on the price of bread. I mean, Nigeria had its fair share.
I was going to say that, that was the next thing. That we're talking about Europe and some, but I mean, you are not saying it, but I mean, that's also there in the subtext.
Back here in Nigeria, we have had to look at alternatives sometime on the program on Business
somebody
Money.
mentioned
millet,
yes. And then, of course, before all this conflict began, there was some talk about cassava at some point and all of that. Perhaps we might need to revisit those more seriously with a great deal of focus.
Well, millet bread is what they are pushing up now, but changing the taste bud of Nigerians.
It's not 6 months.
It is not. It is not.
Now, the Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline is finally taking off. Some would argue, the critics would argue, not in good enough time to take advantage of all of this. But better late than never, will you?
Yeah, well, better late than never. But I think from my own perspective, you mentioned the critics. I'm sorry, maybe I'm part of the critic, because normally when you have projects like this, there's a timeline, to set things in motion. They've been talking about this since 2016. This is only getting a boost now because of what's going on. If things calm down, who says it will continue? And to make it worse, there's no timeline attached to this project. So what's the motivation or the assurance that,
that
you
this
know,
will continue?
will
We're
go
having
through?
elections here next
And
year.
we have, exactly, you know, and if we've been talking about it for how many years, it's just taking off now, and there's no timeline. We don't see, yeah, it's the NNPC Limited and Morocco, they've signed it. I mean, we've been talking about this. We've been talking, Nigeria has over 206 trillion cubic feet of gas reserve. We can do this and we can do that.
But we have not actually done anything
exactly.
in
Now
particular.
we say we are taking off, and we do not see a concrete timeline or plan to ensure that we will follow through. Then, I mean, for someone like me, pardon me, but
it could just be a media hyperbole
yes,
until we're given the facts as to what exactly is going to happen.
and you
now,
know, we still have to talk about the funding. We still have to talk about the funding of
I was
this.
hoping you wouldn't bring that up. But,
I mean, for business, we
yes,
talk about
the funding was going to be part of it. Now, speaking of funding, Egypt is to settle its transactions. I don't know whether it's wholly or partly. You can tell me.
It's partly.
In rubles.
In rubles, yeah,
Okay.
partly. Well, we know that I think I heard you talk about Turkey.
Yes.
And they're facing the consequences. I guess Egypt is not ready for all of that because, you know, they depend a whole lot on Russia for wheat, you know, and all of that. So they have agreed to settle parts of their payments and transactions in rubles, which of course will threaten the ruble more against what Russia is trying to gain. But I mean, the popularity and the, what do I want to call it, the reduction in the dominance of the dollar is still what we're seeing here as Egypt agrees. And
it's happening slowly.
It's slowly, but seems surely.
Yeah, because you know, today you had this country, the other day you had the other country, and so on, partly.
So it sounds scattered, but at the end of the day, if you were to draw a map, you would see that it is slowly but surely gaining grounds, you know, and I mean, I think that's just one of the advantages of Russia having developed its resources, found out its potentials, and then they've developed it. So you have countries and economies depending on them, so they can call the shots. They can say, this is what we want. So Egypt, remember when they had the protests because of wheat and removing subsidy on bread, you know, so if they depend that much on wheat and bread, then Russia can certainly call the shots for them.
There are lessons in this, is what I say. There are lessons in this for all countries, whether they are participant countries or spectator countries.
Yes.
Ini will have details, as always, of these and other stories right after the show on Business Morning, and then later on Business Incorporated, she and the crew. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a look at some of the sports. Brittany Griner's highly publicized legal woes in Russia and the country's invasion of Ukraine has the top WNBA players opting to take their talents elsewhere this offseason. For the past few decades, Russia has been the preferred off-season destination for WNBA players to compete because of the high salaries that can exceed $1 million and the resources and amenities teams offer them. Griner was arrested in February, then detained, and later convicted on drug possession charges and sentenced to 9 years in prison last month. Now her teammate, Brianna Stewart, and other WNBA All-Stars who have made millions playing in Russia are going elsewhere. About 12 WNBA players competed in Russia last winter, but none are heading back this year. After the World Cup, Stewart is going to Turkey to play for Fenerbahce. Top players can make a few $100,000 playing in Turkey, much less than their Russian salaries. The World Anti-Doping Agency WADA president, Witold Banker, says it is still monitoring testing operations in Russia ahead of a decision on whether to reinstate the country despite complications caused by the Ukrainian war. The existing 2-year ban from international sport imposed by WADA on Russia for widespread state-sponsored infringements of doping regulations expires at the end of the year. Some Russians have continued to compete internationally as neutral athletes, including at the last 2 Olympic Games, but the isolation of the country after the start of the war further complicated the process of ensuring doping compliance. Mr. Banker, who reiterated WADA's condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, said the organization was still able to monitor the work of the Russian anti-doping agency, RUSADA. The Ukrainian Fencing Federation has urged interim President Emmanuel Katsiadakis and other senior International Fencing Federation officials to, quote, prevent the return of Russian and Belarusian athletes to the international sports arena. In a concise but passionately worded message, Vadim Gutsat, UFF president, argued that, quote, banning the participation of all Russian and Belarusian athletes in all international competitions was a demonstration that civilized international society is against military aggression in the present-day world. He urged FIE officials to prevent the return of both countries' athletes to international sports arenas, even under a neutral flag, saying that representatives of aggressor countries could not be part of fair and honest Olympic sports while Russia continues with the war. And finally on the program, Her Majesty the late Queen Elizabeth II, as well as a former Prime Minister of Japan, the late Shinzo Abe, and 2016 Global Citizen Award recipients have received tributes at the Atlantic City Awards in New York City. The leaders of Finland and Sweden were also given a Global Citizen Award at the same event. President Sauli Niinistö of Finland, who was unable to attend in person, sent a video message, and the Swedish Prime Minister's Foreign Minister Ann Linde accepted the award as she lashed out against Russia. Both Niinistö and Anderson were recognized for their country's historic decision to join NATO following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Other recipients included the President of the Republic of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, Google and Alphabet CEO Sundar Pichai, as well as Academy Award-winning actor and humanitarian Forrest Whitaker.
Yes, Europe needs the US, but the US also needs Europe. And the world grows more and more insecure and divided. It is imperative that we come even closer together. To paraphrase President Kennedy, we intend to not only ask what NATO can do for us, but what we can do for NATO.
For Sweden, Russia's aggression against a sovereign and democratic neighbor was a watershed moment. Our decision to apply for NATO membership marks the end of more than 200 years of neutrality and non-alignment. And my message is this: you can count on us. Sweden and Finland will continue to be your friends and partners, and once the ratification process is complete, also committed allies.
And that's where we end the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. There's an update at 5 o'clock within the world today. My name is Ladi Akari Dulale. Do enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Good morning.